Welcome to today's webinar on using NEHGS resources to help you find your 17th century New England ancestors. My name is Ginevra Morse, the Online Education Coordinator at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'll be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. And just as a quick note of clarification on today's topic, when we say 17th century, we do mean the year 1601 to 1700. And when we say New England, we're referring to the area that's presently made up of Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Giving today's presentation will be David Dearborn, Senior Genealogist at NEHGS. He's been a genealogist at the Society for nearly 40 years and an expert on early New England, especially the northern states, New York, England, Scotland, and more. David will actually be retiring in actually next month, so you're very lucky you could join us today and benefit from his years of experience. David will give a quick overview of the settlement and migration patterns within New England. Then he'll highlight some of the resources and records available at NEHGS. While many of these resources are accessible as databases on AmericanAncestors.org, David won't go into too much detail on how to search each one, as that has been covered in previous webinars, and you can watch those at AmericanAncestors.org/watch. At any time during this presentation, please feel free to write a question in the panel to the right of your screen. David will answer as many of those as we can in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the hour. And as a reminder, this event is being recorded, and the video will be posted to our website in the next couple of days. So without further ado, let's get started. David, take it away.
Thank you, Ginevra, and welcome everyone. Thank you, Ginevra, and welcome everyone. It's very good to have you all here this afternoon. What I would like to do in this hour is to highlight some of the most popular and reliable sources for researching your 17th century New England ancestors. The New England Historic Genealogical Society since 1845 has been at the forefront of collecting and preserving records of historical and genealogical interest. 17th century New Englanders are probably one of the most studied groups of people that you would find anywhere. It's a fairly small, self-contained area, and those people who arrived during the so-called Great Migration period, that is from about 1620 to 1640, which is when the majority of 17th century New Englanders arrived, were basically arriving in a genealogical vacuum, except for the Native Americans, with whom there was very little reaction in terms of marriage and so forth. They were arriving here basically on a clean slate. Before you really get started into the sources, I think it's important to understand the settlement and migration patterns, because these can help you in your genealogical research to understand the context of who your people were during the 17th century. I know that many of you are not from the New England area originally, and you may be unfamiliar with the geography of the area. New England, of course, is in the northeastern corner of the United States, and if you look at the map here, you will see what is the area now of New England, consisting of Massachusetts and Connecticut, Rhode Island down in the southern part, and then in the northern part, just above western Massachusetts, what is now the state of Vermont, but does not really fit into what we have to say today because it hadn't been settled yet by the New Englanders. And then to the northeast, we have the present states of New Hampshire, and further east, the state of Maine. It's important to understand that Massachusetts has always is figured very largely in New England, not only because of its central position geographically, but because of its population. It's far and away, and has been since day one, the largest of the New England colonies, and it probably would be hard to find any one of you with New England ancestors in the 17th century who do not have ancestors living in Massachusetts. Number two in terms of population would be Connecticut, then Rhode Island, New Hampshire and Maine were much smaller. Northern New England in general, even though it's a bigger area, is a much smaller area in terms of population. You'll see that throughout this map, which shows most of the major towns that were settled by 1700, that there are very few north of Massachusetts, and most of the settlements, regardless, tend to be along the coast, which is what we would expect. There were also settlements going up and down the Connecticut River Valley and to a lesser extent up into the Merrimack Valley as well. If you look at the map down at the very bottom, you'll see Long Island, which, even though Long Island technically is not part of New England, it was genealogically, because the eastern three-quarters of Long Island was settled by people from mostly Massachusetts Bay who went down there in the 1640s and 50s, and from there some of them went on to settle places like Newark, New Jersey, Piscataway, Cape May, and other places, and all of this was prior to 1700. What is now Maine was actually part of Massachusetts until 1800, which isn't really going to affect record keeping very much, because the basic type of record that many of you will be looking for, that is the town records, will still be in the towns in Maine regardless. Even today, county records will still be in the county. It would only be records of a colony-wide basis. Since the state of Maine did not yet exist, the records would be in Boston. What's now Massachusetts was divided into two colonies, the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony, prior to 1686, taking up the southeastern part of Massachusetts. The two colonies merged at that time amicably and have been the same ever since. There are some surviving records for Plymouth Colony. Rhode Island and Connecticut also were two different colonies prior to a certain date. And it's useful to know and understand all of that as you are getting into your research, just where people were from. The diagram that you see here illustrates the approximate rate of migration as it was year by year between 1620 and 1640, the period of the Great Migration. 1620, of course, signals the arrival of the Mayflower, and 1640 is the period when political changes going on in England, that is the changes in Parliament with the takeover of Parliament by the Puritan faction, which was in opposition to the king, and the subsequent outbreak a few years later of the English Civil War, meant that those people who were living in England who might have thought of immigrating realized that things were happening, and so the immigration pretty much stopped. But you'll see that even though this period of the Great Migration covers approximately 20 years, the vast majority of our ancestors actually arrived in this great bubble of 1633 to 1640. This reflects the period when Archbishop Laud became the Archbishop of Canterbury and was a great persecutor of the Puritans, causing many of them to emigrate. You'll also see this spike in 1630, which coincides with the arrival of the Winthrop fleet in Boston. This is a full decade after the arrival of the Mayflower, but you can see, looking at the earlier years, that relatively few people were actually living in New England prior to about 1629 or so. The settlements were very, very tiny and really kind of scraped along for that 10-year period. It's really the 1630s is when most of our ancestors actually arrived. This is a book that I would suggest that you look at if you're interested in knowing more about how New England, the unfolding of settlements in New England took place, how it was populated. This book was written in 1909 by Lois Kimball Matthews. It was reprinted a year or two ago by NEHGS, and even though the book is now over a century old, it is still, to my mind, a wonderful piece of scholarship. It has very, very many specific examples of specific towns in New England, who the settlers were, what towns they came from previously, the migration routes that they took, and so forth. the book is illustrated with a series of maps showing the areas of settlement as they were in New England at different times. And over on the right you can see two different maps, one showing the area of settlement as of 1675 and the other at about 1812. And you can see from the 1675 map how as I said earlier, the area of settlement was pretty much confined to southern New England with this little strip going up the Connecticut River Valley, but more or less hugging the coast with just a rather a tiny little strip of settlement right along the northern coast going up about a little beyond Casco Bay, and that was it. 1675 was significant because that was the year of King Philip's War, and after that time, by 1677, the area of settlement was drastically reduced. Pretty much all of the area where the Arrow is located now along the coast of New Hampshire and Maine was basically abandoned, and people kind of pulled their horns in, and the settlement was pretty much down in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And that situation went on for maybe about another 30 years or so until the population had grown significantly and people felt really strong and safe enough that the push to expand geographically took over again. And then in the second map you can see that by 1812 the area of settlement had taken up pretty much all of the southern part of New England, with really only the northern part of the state of Maine remaining unsettled, as it is for the most part even today. If you're going to be looking at New England, it's a matter not only of knowing what to do, but where to go. And the Genealogist's Handbook for New England Research, which the Society has published now in several editions, is a book that I refer to just about constantly, not only as I'm going about New England doing research on my own family, but in answering questions of patrons in the library. This book is pretty much up to date and contains chapters for each state with how-to information for the different counties and towns and states, contact information, addresses, hours, websites, and so forth. It's gone through so many editions because, of course, this information is constantly changing and we're updating it all of the time. So it's really a where to go if you want to really kind of get your feet wet in New England research or are planning a trip here, just to understand just what records exist where they are. For each New England state, we're also given a list of the towns in that particular state, where in the columns we're given an alphabetical list of the towns, including their dates of incorporation or when they were founded, what county the towns are in, whether those towns were created out of some parent town or towns, whether other towns were split off from them, and any other particular notes. For example, whether the town might have been created earlier or incorporated but not actually settled until later or earlier. And then way over on the right, whether there are vital records available in some form easily for that town, whether they've been microfilmed with an M, whether they've been published, whether they constitute a website on AmericanAncestors.org, and the same thing for church records. And this exists for all 6 of the different New England states. The book also has over 80 maps, which are very handy for showing both the county and the town boundaries. Here we see Washington County in the state of Maine, and you can see that there are certain areas, only those areas that are marked in bold are actual incorporated towns. Those areas that are lightly shaded indicate unincorporated areas. And it's useful not only for knowing what the towns are, but where they're located and what the neighboring towns might possibly be. To learn more about New England towns, you can go to AmericanAncestors.org/town-guides to get a full list of information on New England towns with additional references and links to various sites on American Ancestors where you can learn more information. It will give similar information as to what you'll find in the New England Handbook. Finding aids. I want to get now into kind of the nitty-gritty of actually how to look up your ancestors. If you're looking for somebody in the 17th century, where do you start? The first source that I would suggest looking at would be Clarence Torrey's New England Marriages Prior to 1700. This is a monumental work that contains references to approximately 38,000 couples who either were married in England or in the old country, who arrived as married couples here by the year 1700, or who were married here. And it includes not only instances where we actually have the marriage record of the couple and know the full identities of both the husband and the wife, but also cases where we may not know the wife's maiden name, we may not know her identity or the exact date of the marriage, but yet there may still be information on that couple that might be useful. Mr. Torrey was simply a private genealogist. He was not employed by NEHGS, but he used the library as a patron, and in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, he went from one end of the library to another, examining every single book that he could put his hands on, and not only monographic books on various families, but genealogical periodicals such as the Register, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the American Genealogist, and other journals, also town histories and local historical, genealogical, and antiquarian journals. Anytime he found a reference to a couple who met his criteria, that is, married by 1700 or approximately, he would include a reference to that source next to that couple's name. The Society published this guide back in 2011, and it has also been available in several editions, including CD-ROM and on our website. Here we see a typical citation from Torrey. Here we have Henry Adams and his wife Elizabeth Payne, and next to Henry we see in parentheses his dates of birth and death, 1610 to 1676, the same kind of information for his wife. Following that, we have the date that they were married, and then the place where they were married, and or their places of principal residence. Following that, within the curly brackets, is where we get into the meat of it, the sources that Mr. Torrey looked at that indicate some reference to this particular couple. Some of these may be redundant to one another. In order to save space, Mr. Torrey abbreviated his sources drastically to fit everything in. So when he refers to something called Bartlett Jenkins, that's some genealogy on the Bartlett and Jenkins family, followed by the page number, and so forth. If you use Torrey a lot, after a while you will become familiar with what these sources are, but you don't really have to worry about that because, as we'll see in a moment, we can get to the list of the sources to find out what those are. It's important to remember that Mr. Torrey died in 1962, and therefore the genealogical scholarship of the last 50 years or so is not going to be included, but it will include all of the classical sources up to that time. If you visit AmericanAncestors.org, Torrey's Marriage Index is one of the databases that is offered. If you just click there on Advanced Criteria and just go to the list of databases, you'll see Torrey's Marriage Index indicated. We can do a search here. I can put in my own last name of Dearborn, and when we click on the search button, we get 10 hits here. And then by clicking on that first one, we get the specific citation there, in this case to someone that I might want to look at, Godfrey Dearborn, who was born 1603 with a question mark indicating that that year is not certain. And here we see his first wife, whose name is just blank. We don't know who she was. She says blank blank. But it turns out she's the mother of his children, and we see that she was living in 1650. That's all that we know. And then when it says in England, it doesn't mean that she was living in England. That's where they were married. So they married by 1632, and then they settled in Exeter, New Hampshire. And then following that, as in the example previous, we get the different references to where we can go to find out more information about Godfrey Dearborn. And then by clicking down below where it says read the full introduction to Torrey, if any of you are interested in learning about Torrey and how he put that together, I would suggest that. But to find the list of the sources, you go down just below that and click where it says read the guide, and that's going to open up a PDF document such as this, which will list his abbreviations to the different sources that he used. Mr. Torrey didn't actually put this list together. This is simply a list of the sources he used. He did this manuscript. We don't really know why, whether it's just for his own amusement, but certainly it's monumental and of value to us all. But he often used rather cryptic abbreviations. We can see over here, there are a couple of them here, which when we tried to figure out what did his abbreviations mean, we weren't able to identify them. Obviously, there were sources that the library had at one time, but that was over 50 years ago, and some of these we've not been able to identify. But the great majority of the sources that he lists are indeed to published books or journal articles or town or local histories that are readily identified that we have right here in the library. And in fact, for many of you living elsewhere, you might be able to find these books either online through Google Books, because the books are now out of copyright and have been digitized, or you might be able to find them in some other library. After Torrey, the next source that I usually look at to find out about 17th century families is a book called Founders of Early American Families by Meredith Colquitt. Meredith Colquitt was a great genealogist of the 20th century. He published this book in, or I should say there were 3 different versions of this book that have appeared. Mr. Colquitt passed away in 1985, just as the second revised edition of his book came out. There was a 3rd edition of it in 2004 done by someone else, but it is, I would say, a very slight improvement over the 1985 edition. Basically what this book is an alphabetical list of those known settlers who arrived in what's now the 13 colonies of the United States prior to 1657, that is, within the first 50 years of settlement after Jamestown, with enough information to identify who these people are. This was done in 1985, so the beauty of this is that it kind of picks up in a way where Mr. Torrey left off and kind of takes in the next 20 years worth of scholarship. It does include people from the other colonies outside of New England. You're going to find your early New York Dutch in there, some of your early Virginia planters, but by and large, I would say probably about 80+% of the individuals who are listed in Founders of Early American Families are actually New Englanders. But they had to have been here by 1657. But that will include all of your Great Migration individuals. As I said earlier, there were not that many people who arrived in New England post-1640. So most of the families that were here by 1700, their ancestors were already here by 1640. So unless the family was really small, obscure, has never been written up, at least as of 1985, you can see whether there was a book or article that might talk about them. Since that time, the slack has been taken up by another work called New Englanders in the 1600s, published by, compiled by Martin Hollick and published by NEHGS. The second expanded edition goes all the way down to 2010. And this basically picks up where Colquitt left off, except Martin was a little more broad in his definition of who he wanted to treat. It wasn't just people who were here by 1657, but all the way down to the year 1700. But only the last 30 years worth of scholarship. In other words, anything published between 1980 and 2010. And as you can see, many of the references are to journal articles. If we look here at Bernard Capon, for example, we see a reference to NEHGR, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register. And one of the beauties of this is that many of the sources that are listed in here, or I should say many of the more important sources, tend to be journal articles that you will be able to find on American Ancestors. You don't have to go hunting around for these, or regardless of where you live. If you're an NEHGS member, you can go onto the website americanancestors.org and you can actually look up these references. So if you take Torrey and Colquitt and Hollick and take those three together, you really have a very good literature search of what already has been done on New Englanders in the 17th century. Now, refining that a little further, Robert Charles Anderson has taken it to the next level. NEHGS back in the 1990s and 2000 sponsored his research into re-looking at or re-evaluating what had been done for the Great Migration period, looking at these people again and the second generation, their offspring. And between 1995 and about 2 years ago, Mr. Anderson produced a series of 10 volumes covering all known immigrants to New England between the years 1620 and 1635. Volumes 1 through 3 covering those who arrived by 1633, A to Z, and then the last 7 volumes covering just those who arrived in 1634 and 1635. So you can see the great disparity, 3 volumes for 13 years and 7 volumes for just 2 years, which illustrates that great hump that I showed you in that chart earlier of when people actually arrived. The great majority of them arrived in the middle to late 1630s rather than in the 1620s. And in each case, he includes a biographical and genealogical sketch. Here we have Edward Rossiter. I chose just as an example because the entire sketch fits very nicely on 2 opposing pages. We are given for him his basic biographical information, if it is known where he came from, and in many cases we don't know where the person was from, and then biographical information further about this individual, and then finally down below we get the begats, born, married, died, and a list of children. And for practically every statement listed, we get an abbreviated source of where that information is coming from. In this case, NBCR, which refers to the Massachusetts Bay colony records, which are in print. And of course, on the front of the books, he includes a bibliography, or I should say a list of the abbreviations that he uses within this book. Again, many of them are published works. Again, those of you with 17th century ancestors, it's such a small group of people, relatively speaking, compared to, say, the 18th century, that many of the sources are already in print. A lot of times I'll get the question, well, why don't I see my ancestor listed in the Great Migration volumes? According to the genealogy of the X family, my ancestor was supposed to have been here in 1632. Well, maybe the genealogy says that, but where is the evidence? Mr. Anderson looked at this in a very dispassionate way. He looked at the records just as they were, and if your ancestor shows up in a record, then he will include them. If not, then they simply don't make the cut. He says there's no evidence showing that the ancestor was here that early, is the basic ancestor. The Great Migrations series, both the Great Migration Begins volumes going down to 1633 and the continuation down to 34-35 are available as databases on AmericanAncestors.org, as are the Great Migration newsletter and the ancillary volumes that he published, the Winthrop Fleet, the Pilgrim Migrations, and so forth. For those of you who are interested in further information about the Great Migration Study Project or would be interested in signing up for one of the Great Migration tours to England, something I'd love to do myself, you can go to the website greatmigration.org. We're continuing with our research at NEHGS into 17th century families by instituting the Early New England Family Study Project, which is being undertaken by the eminent genealogist Alicia Crane Williams. This information is unfolding even as we speak. It's available online, only on AmericanAncestors.org, and only for our members. Just about every week, Alicia's rolling out a new sketch of a new early settler, and you can find those on the website. To date, she's posted sketches of 34 different immigrants, and you can see from the format that the type of information listed for these individuals is very similar to what you find in what Bob Anderson pioneered in the Great Migration volumes. Basic information categorized by type, so migration, residences, parentage, birth, baptism if known. In this case, born about 1610, based on his age as given in his will in the 80th year of my age. But we don't know where he was from. Died in Swansea, Massachusetts, married. His bride's name was Christian, but we don't know who she was, and so forth. But nevertheless, this may be a more complete sketch of John Allen than has appeared anywhere else. So this is something that I would highly recommend that you look at and continue to look at as the new sketches unfold. Whenever you're doing your genealogy in the 17th century, because there's so much literature already in print, it's always worthwhile to see what already has been done before you start going around to reinvent the wheel. A lot of it is already there. Here are a couple of books that I recommend that are worth looking at to see what might be available and are readily available. All three of these books were recently reissued in paperback by NEHGS. Pope's Pioneers of Massachusetts was originally published in 1900, and he tries to go beyond what Savage's Genealogical Dictionary did, which was published back in the 1850s. Mr. Pope tried to take the next 50 years of scholarship that had been done, encapsulate that just for Massachusetts. And as I said earlier, because Massachusetts was the largest state or colony in terms of population, just about everybody either lived in or passed through Massachusetts at some time in the 17th century, or many, many families did. Pretty much all of us are going to be interested in this. It's a very worthwhile book looking at. Goodwin's Genealogical Notes on some of the first settlers of Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay is a lot older, but certainly for what he has to say about the Connecticut people is certainly worth looking at as a source. And then finally, for those of you with northern New England ancestors, the Genealogical Dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire really is a must-see book. It is certainly the most detailed and comprehensive of the three. It was published in parts by three eminent genealogists between 1928 and 39. It has been reprinted many times, most recently by NEHGS just a couple of years ago. It includes genealogical information in a very, very condensed form. Here's an example of anyone who was in Maine or New Hampshire by 1699 with several generations of their descendants. So here's a typical sketch. My own ancestor, Godfrey Dearborn. You will see here that each of these sketches is numbered. So we see Godfrey as number 1. We see Henry here as number 2. And you can see after his name, and they would possibly continue depending upon how many of the name there are. And then you'll see after Henry's name the number 1 in parentheses. That means that he's the son of number 1, that is of number 1 being Godfrey up here. For each individual, we're given a brief, very condensed sketch of where this person is from. In this case, we have his origins, who his parents are. The book is heavily abbreviated, So you'll get this GRJ standing for grand jury, meaning that he served on the grand jury. And then you'll see references to these lists, which are, again, a way of saving space. These are at the front of the volume. If you're really serious about knowing more about your ancestor, usually in a biographical sense, these lists are very worthwhile. The book is the result of scholarship of three very, very eminent genealogists. Even though this book now is about 90 years old, it has really not been superseded in any way. If you have any questions about ancestors in the 17th or early 18th century in Maine and New Hampshire, this book probably is going to answer them. It's important also not to overlook periodicals. Oftentimes people don't go through them because of the perceived difficulty of use. Who wants to trudge through umpty-ump volumes of a journal and maybe not even find what it is you're looking for? However, they're useful because a lot of the best and most scholarly and up-to-date research appears here. The material that appears in journals such as the New England Historical and Genealogical Register and its various sister journals such as the American Genealogist, New York G&B Record, and so forth. These are all articles that have been written by genealogists such as you and me, but that have been vetted by an editor and therefore have to meet the highest critical standards. What's nice is that more and more of these journals are being digitized and placed online. And the AmericanAncestors.org website at the moment offers more than 25 different periodicals, these being just a few of them. The Register, of course, is completely online. The New York G&B Record, you can search now from the beginning in 1870 all the way down to 1923. The American Genealogist all the way down to 2007. All you need to do is just go on to American Ancestors and just go into journals and periodicals, and you'll get a list of those journals, which you then can click on and search to see whether an ancestor appears. And when you do this, you're going to see the actual page from the journal. So here's just an example of what you might find. In this case, something from the Register you'll see up there at the top for the year 1853 with an article on early settlers of the counties of Essex and Old Norfolk in Massachusetts with a list there from whatever source it was that they were taken from. Now, what kind of records survive from the 17th century? Fortunately, our 17th century ancestors were really quite scrupulous record keepers, and obviously not everything survives from that period or really from any period. Records were not always kept as up to 21st century standards, where records have been lost. But here we have a list of the types of typical records that you should look at and be aware that would exist for the 17th century. Obviously, vital records are probably the principal type of record, records of births, marriages, and deaths, which for many instances exist on the town level from the earliest days. Church records, which can be a great adjunct to vital records. Remembering that in the 17th century, for the most part, it was kind of a one-company town. It was basically the Puritan church, which later on became the Congregational church. Most towns in the 17th century, there was only one church, and your ancestors either belonged to that church or at least paid lip service to it or show up in those records. Town records can be useful for listing town officers, records of town meetings, tax rolls, warnings out, and so forth. Court records can be particularly useful. In many cases, your ancestors might have given depositions in court in which they would list their occupation and their age. In many cases, you'll get very interesting and often unflattering biographical vignettes of your ancestor. Maybe he was hauled into court for drunkenness. This might not actually be the reason why you went into genealogy, but nevertheless, it does illustrate that our ancestors were indeed human beings, just as we all are. And military records, I mentioned, of course, King Philip's War. Anytime we have a war, of course, this is unfortunate, but it's good from a genealogical standpoint, unless, of course, records are destroyed. But in many cases, when there is some sort of military conflict or campaign, it actually creates records. So we're fortunate to have surviving lists of soldiers or people who served in the militia in the colonial wars. Probate records, wills, in most of the cases these records happily survive and are something that we should be using. And then finally notarial records, which will again shed both biographical and in some cases genealogical light on our 17th century ancestors. As I said, Massachusetts is kind of the 100-pound gorilla in New England in terms of its importance and significance for genealogy. Most of us, our ancestors, are going to have lived at some point in Massachusetts. And this book, whose title you can see, is a very, very useful book because it is an official report to the government of Massachusetts in 1889 that goes county by county and town by town and church by church of what records existed as of 1889. And I don't know how many of you have gone, say, to a town clerk's office and been told, oh, we don't have any records. Well, by referring to this book, you can see, well, you did in 1889, what happened to them? The book is divided up into several sections. One section has to do with churches, and this is sliced and diced two different ways. You can look up what churches existed by town, so that we can look, for example, in 1889 at the town of Sharon in Norfolk County, and we can see that there were several different churches that existed in the town. The earliest, of course, being the Congregational Church, and you can see the Unitarian Church is listed as 1740 also. Well, it's basically the same church. It's simply split into Congregational and Unitarian factions, and whether the records were complete. There's also a separate section in the book which is arranged by denomination. And then over on the right-hand side, we get the civil part, the records for different towns. So here we're looking at the town in the middle of the page there, the town of Stoughton. And we can see here that there are, in the town clerk's custody, volumes of town proceedings, births, marriages, and deaths, selectmen and assessors records, and miscellaneous, the numbers of volumes, years covered, who exactly in the town has custody of these records, whether they're indexed, their condition, and so forth. So if you go to a town hall, the town clerk tries to buffalo about records, you can say, well, some predecessor of yours apparently lost them, or you're not looking hard enough, because these records did exist as recently as 1889. And then following that, for each town, we're given a chronological sort of a history of the town from its creation down to that point in terms of its geographic evolution. To look a little more specifically at types of records, as I said, vital records probably are arguably the single most important type of record that we can look at. Many but not all survive for the 17th century. Even when they do survive, they're often incomplete. That is, not everything was recorded. Oftentimes this was the fault not of the town clerk, but of the families who didn't either know that they were supposed to record things or just simply didn't care. So a lot of people fall through the cracks. But fortunately for us, many of the records that survive for the 17th century have been transcribed and published. For those from Massachusetts, for example, prior to 1850, 158 towns out of the 351 have been published. These books have all been digitized, and the contents are available as a database on AmericanAncestors.org. We can see here an example of one of the pages here, this from the town of Dedham, where we can see, starting in 1635, the very first record. And you can see that this is a transcription showing the records exactly as they were. So you can see here where it says Mary, daughter of John and Hannah Dwight, born the 25th of the 5th month in the year 1635. So this, of course, is using the old style dating of months where March was the first month. So therefore, this child would have been born on the 25th of July in 1635 and so forth. Maybe you can't find that vital record that you're looking for. So you might want to consider substitute records, remembering that maybe something wasn't recorded at all, Maybe it was recorded in another town. My suggestion would be to try such things as gravestones, church records, which often act as a substitute for the vital records, probate records where you might have a will that might name children, land deeds where relationships might be stated, court records, any other type of record that might give genealogical relationships or might simply show that the person existed and was alive on the date that the record was created. Another type of record, which again is often people are aware that they exist but may be afraid to look at them because they just don't feel comfortable or don't understand quite how probate records work, are the records of the probate. Normally these records are arranged by county, and of course realizing that the county boundaries have changed over the centuries. They may not be the same now as they were back in the 17th century. If you're looking at wills and probate records, you have to remember that if you're dealing with Rhode Island, that instead of being kept by county, they're kept by town. In Connecticut, they're kept by probate district, but certainly in Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire, they were kept by county, as you're going to find them in most of the United States. Recently, NEHGS posted a database of original probate documents from Essex County, Massachusetts, the area north of Boston. And you can see the actual images. Here we see the will of Anthony Morse, Jr. of Newbury, made in 1678. This particular database covers probate records for the year 1638 to 1840. As I say, it's on AmericanAncestors.org. It includes over 30,000 cases. There are over 400,000 individual file papers within the database. So it's just a very, very, very rich database for those of you with ancestors up on the North Shore. One of the most common questions that I get regards passenger lists. And one of the most common questions I get about them is, how can I find my ancestors' passenger list? If you're talking about the 17th century, you have to remember that passenger lists in the 17th century were not kept the same way as they were in the 19th century. Many of them simply no longer exist. What does survive is basically already in print. So for those of you, of course, who have ancestors who are known to have arrived by 1635, you can simply refer to the Great Migration volumes to see whether it is known that that ancestor's name appears on a passenger list or not. These three books are the books that I recommend that you look at for actual passenger lists. Coldham's Complete Book of Emigrants, 4-volume set, although the later volumes cover a later period of time after 1700 and cover, in many cases, people who went to other colonies, particularly Virginia, the southern colonies, Barbados, and so forth. Excuse me. Houghton's Original List of Persons of Quality, which the Society recently reprinted, and then finally Charles Edward Banks's Planters of the Commonwealth, which is by far the least helpful of the three because he often took the original records and made editorial comments to them that really sort of muddy the waters a bit, whereas Coldham and Houghton tried to adhere much more to the original. You have to remember that there were never any official records kept in the New England colonies of arrival of ships. It just simply didn't happen. The records that we know about of people coming over mainly come from two sources that survive from England: the port books that have survived and the licenses to travel overseas. Fortunately, for the year 1635, for the Port of London, we have a very large collection of licenses to travel overseas, and that's how we know about so many people who arrived in New England during that year of 1635. Obviously, as we already know, similar numbers of people were arriving in the other years, but the licenses and the port books just simply haven't survived. So all we can say about these people, even if they fall outside of the period of Bob Anderson's Great Migration Project, is that they simply pop up by a certain period. Their name suddenly starts appearing in records, and we probably will never know exactly what ship the ancestors came on. And this goes for the later period of time, all the way down into the early 1700s. We simply have to resign ourselves to knowing what is already known. But having said that, that does not necessarily mean that you cannot find the person's English origins over in the old country. To find out about what we have here in the library, whether for any particular family or any other subject that we might have, you should go to our online catalog. This has everything that we have. The default is to search by keyword, but if you know of a particular book that you're looking for, or if you want to search by a subject, you can do it that way too. You can just go in and type in Dearborn family, for example, or Hampton, New Hampshire, or whatever it is that you're looking for, and you can see whether we have that item. There are other ways that the Society can help you as well. You can find a list of resources, video, and other how-to tips at the subject guide available at our online learning center. And finally, you can also schedule a consultation with an expert, or you can hire our research team. And remember that both the consultations and the research service can be done remotely. You do not have to visit the Society in person. You can do all of that long distance. Here's a little checklist, a review of some of the databases that I've mentioned and which of these are available to NEHGS members and to non-members. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attendance. This has been a great experience for me to be able to reach all of you today, and I hope that this has been worthwhile. And now we'll stop and take a few questions. Thank you.
Thanks, David, for that wonderful presentation. A lot of people have already entered questions into that question panel. If you have a question for David on anything that he's covered in this presentation, please feel free to type it into that question panel. So David, we have a question from Linda who asks, are most records from this time period held at the town level?
Yes and no. The records are kept on really any level. They're going to be kept on the town level, they're going to be kept on the county level, and they're going to be kept on the state/colony level. You have to understand what the records are. What you always would want to do whenever you're searching regardless of the century would be to start with the lowest level, that is the town, which all through New England is the basic jurisdiction. Here you're going to find your vital records. You're going to find, that is your births, marriages, and deaths. You're going to find your town records, your town meeting records if your ancestor was elected to a local office, tax rolls, all your property taxes which your ancestors paid, all of that was on the local level. At the county level, and this goes at least certainly for Massachusetts, but not necessarily for the other colonies, this is where you're going to find things like your land records, your probate records, and your court records. And then finally at the state or colony records, you're going to find things like generally like military records, petitions to the general court, which is the colonial legislature, things like that.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Linda, for that great question. Wayne asks, where would you find the vital records for Maine towns that were once part of Massachusetts?
Okay, first of all, you can look at the the Genealogist Handbook from New England Research. Look at the chapter on Maine to see whether the records prior to 1892, which tends to be the cutoff date in Maine, whether they're already available in print. If you are talking about the 17th century, if there are any vital records, they probably already were looked at and are going to be listed in the Genealogical Dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire, would basically be my answer. And then I guess the final thing probably would be for the specific town, you can look on familysearch.org and look at their catalog under the specific town to see whether they might be microfilmed. NEHGS has microfilms of maybe about half of the towns in Maine here, I would say.
Thanks. We have a few questions about notarial records. What are they and where could they be found?
Notarial records There aren't really very many of them, but when they exist, they're very useful. There are two notaries that were active in Massachusetts in the 17th century. Thomas Letchford, L-E-C-H-F-O-R-D, and I think his name was William Aspinwall. If you just remember those two names, Letchford and Aspinwall. Basically what they did, they were just like a notary public today. If you had some sort of a document that you wanted recorded officially, you would go to a notary and either tell or dictate that document, and he was a person who would take a deposition and it would be certified. And what's lovely about Letchford and Aspinwall not only is that their record books survived and have been published, but that they were dealing in the period of the 1630s and 1640s, a time where we're talking about the people who actually had come over from England, and in a great many cases the depositions that they were taking down had to do with affairs that the colonists had, basically tying up loose ends in England. It might be when they came over, they might have been in their 20s, 30s, 40s, relatively young. They may have left elderly parents behind. When they came over, it wasn't just a one-way street. There was still communication back and forth. If you remember, all of the ships that brought people over to the colonies, what happened to those ships? Well, they went back either empty, I suppose, at least of passengers, or more likely they might be bringing some people back to England, but they probably were bringing cargo of various kinds, lumber, fish, whatever it might be, but they also carried mail and messages. So there was communication back and forth, and it might be that word got back to the colonists here that maybe elderly parent had died, left them a bequest, and so they would go to the notary to have documents notarized or recorded that might have to do with that. So there are a great many clues, that some of which have not been thoroughly explored, to English origins in the records of the notaries.
Great. And Jerry asks, what is the scope of the Early New England Family Study Project? What families are being covered, and what's kind of the year range for that project?
Okay, it's pretty open-ended. It's really anything from where the Great Migration period that Bob Anderson did in 1635 stops, and coming forward to about 1700 or so, approximately. If you look at oh boy, where was it now? There was an article in American Ancestors. I can't quite read the date. I think it was within about the last year. If you look at American Ancestors magazine, I think in 2012 or so, there was an article in there by Alicia Williams on the Early New England Family Study Project that talks about the scope, basically. But I believe it's basically the 17th century. So it's going to go on.
Great, and we have a question from Kathy. Does the drop-off in immigration in 1640 apply to those arriving in Long Island, New York?
From where, Jennifer? From England. Oh, from England. Well, as I say, it dropped off because of what was going on in England in terms of the colonies. Now, what was happening in the other colonies, let's say Virginia, I don't know, but if you read and study about the English Civil War, the decade of the 1640s, a lot of people in England were Puritan, certainly not the majority, but a great many of them were. They were becoming increasingly radicalized by the suppression of the king. They were being heavily taxed, which they thought was for no good reason. Animosity broke out. Eventually, the Puritan faction took over Parliament. Of course, the king had to go to Parliament to get money to fund his government. Parliament said no, and eventually conflict broke out. But those people who were still in England, who were of the Puritan persuasion, could see the writing on the wall that their day was coming, so therefore there wasn't any reason, or the main reason for leaving England, coming to New England, was gone. And that basically was why the migration basically dried up. Not completely, but about 95%.
Thanks, David. We're almost out of time, so I'll just ask one more question. Again, thank you everyone for your questions and your feedback throughout the presentation. Anne asks, does your library catalog include diaries, letters, and other personal materials?
Yes, absolutely. My suggestion, if you're looking for any particular subject such as that, is go into the catalog and click on the subject tab. And then you can simply type in the word diaries, letters, whatever, and see what pops up. And then you can filter from there. And oftentimes what you'll do if you get a subject which is really very broad is you'll be given a number of different subjects. For example, it might say diaries dash 17th century, diaries dash 18th century, or it might say diaries dash Massachusetts, Connecticut, Boston, what have you. You can also use the advanced feature. You'll see a tab way over at the right at the top that says Advanced, and by clicking on that you can do a Boolean search. And what you can do in a case like that is you can then put in a field, you can put in a subject, for example diaries, and then you can specify that you only want to search not printed works in the library, which you might also have seen elsewhere, but manuscript items. You can narrow down your search to manuscripts. And that goes not only for diaries, but if you just want to know, for example, what we have on a certain family, rather than looking at all the books, you can see just what manuscript material that we might have.
Thanks again, everyone, for your questions. If we haven't gotten to your question about how to find your 17th century New England ancestor, feel free to contact us at library@nehgs.org. Also, if you have more detailed questions about the specifics of your research, how to locate records or ancestors, or how to break down some of those genealogical brick walls, you may want to consider scheduling either a consultation or hiring our research services team. If you're interested in learning more about these services, you can write to the email addresses on your screen, but I'll also include this information in the follow-up email. Also, if you're an NEHGS member, you may want to register for David's online course happening on March 8th entitled Bridging the Atlantic from New England Back to England, in which David will discuss how to trace your English ancestry without having to hop the pond. These more in-depth online courses are available exclusively to NEHGS members. For more information about the course or to enroll, visit americanancestors.org/online-courses. Finally, thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey on today's presentation. As we continue to expand our online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful. Be sure to explore our website, americanancestors.org, which offers access to millions of records covering New England, New York, and beyond. And if you're ever in the Boston area, please feel free to stop by our research library and archives. We're open to the public and hold a vast collection of published genealogies, biographies, local histories, microfilms, manuscripts, and more. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center, americanancestors.org/learning-center. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.